We have a couple of things to finish up with the 19th century, and then we will focus on the 20th century and the three classes we have left after, before Thanksgiving, and then the after Thanksgiving we just have the one class which will focus on the 21st century. And we're in the section of talking about changes and developments in practice in Christianity in the 19th century. When we were in the 18th century, we talked about this period of time of revivalism and Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, this increase in this emotional form of Christianity that led to a lot of people identifying as Christians, as membership in churches, particularly in New England, and we didn't really have time to talk about some other places. But those revivals occurred on and off throughout the rest of the 18th century, often little revivals, not anywhere near the period or the size of what's often known as the Great Awakening. In the late 18th century into the 19th century, however, there was this sudden appearance of revivals across several different places. And essentially it developed along three separate fronts, this second Great Awakening. Focusing on the West, now remember, this is 1800, so the West is Kentucky. And this is before the Louisiana Purchase, anything like that. So the West, New England, and the Mid-Atlantic. And in each of these, there are some similarities in that there was this emotional connection to Christianity. There was a deeper commitment expressed by a lot of people. Christianity grew, but there were also a lot of differences. Let's look at each of these fronts and talk a little bit about how they were different and what was occurring there. Now, the West, again, is the frontier. It's sparsely settled. There are very few religious communities. A lot of people there are focused on land, getting land, clearing land, setting up houses, setting up communities, those kind of things. It was also a place of a lot of violence. And so religious gatherings weren't that frequent, but were gradually starting to occur more. Responsible for a lot of the revivalism in the West was a man named James McGreedy, who had moved to North Carolina when he was young. He was a Presbyterian, and eventually moved to western Kentucky, southwestern Kentucky, and had two rather sizable revivals. One was in a place known as Red River, where it was said that the floor was covered by the slain, those slain in the spirit, those that had gotten so worked up by the messages that they had passed out on the floor. Others screamed for mercy, and those screams pierced the heavens. Also, in another place, Gasper River, people had come from hundreds of miles to hear McGreedy speak, and it's estimated that up to 8,000 people were there. McGreedy was also connected with another revival in the city of Cane Ridge. And it's perhaps Cane Ridge that is the most sizable of those early revivals, and one that a lot of people look to as one of importance, Cane Ridge, Kentucky. The minister of the Presbyterian Church in Cane Ridge was a man named Martin W. Stone, who we talked about earlier when we talked about Restorationism. But at this time, Stone was not a Restorationist. He had grown up Anglican and had actually been converted to Presbyterianism by McGreedy and some others, and had gone and saw some of McGreedy's methods and decided to adopt them at the Cane Ridge Church. And in fact, in consultation with McGreedy, decided to have a large meeting at Cane Ridge in 1801. It's estimated that 10,000 to 20,000 people came to the meeting in Cane Ridge. At the time, Lexington was the largest city in Kentucky. It had 1,800 people. And so these people are drawn from all over the place to come to this religious meeting in the city of Cambridge. It's estimated between 10,000 and 20,000, so somewhere in there.
There's also a preacher number.
That might be preacher's camp. It was somewhere between 10,000. It was 50,000 people. So it's estimated around 10,000 to 20,000. Which, of course, we know of universities that can pack 80,000 people in their football stands. We're not surprised by those numbers, but at the time, it's a rather sizable group. Now, so picture it. Thousands of people in this wide open space near Cane Ridge. And in this area, this clearing, there are several preaching stands set up with preachers, all of whom, not all of whom, but many of whom are preaching at the same time. Right? And so you might have several different preachers all preaching, and people are just kind of drifting between these preaching stands, making it a very confusing type of situation. But it's not just Presbyterian ministers. There are Baptist ministers, there are Methodist ministers there as well, all speaking into the night, fires and torches being lit so that people could still hear the preaching. Eventually, this kind of starts some thinking in Stone's mind about how here are these people, Christians, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and they're all gathered here together, and the concerns for these labels, the Baptist label, the Methodist label, the Presbyterian label, it seems to be non-existent. There isn't that concern of, grouping together in your clump according to this name. And this, along with several other things, eventually encouraged Stone and some others to leave Presbyterianism in an attempt to create a movement that would just use the name Christian without some of the denominational names of the times. And he wrote, along with some others, in a document called The Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery, about how he wanted to see, and how they wanted to see this small group of former Presbyterian ministers wanted to see this uniting. And so, quoting from The Last Will and Testament, "We will that this body die, be dissolved, and sink into union with the body of Christ at large. For there is but one body and one Spirit, even as we are called in one hope of our calling. We will that preachers and people cultivate a spirit of mutual forbearance, pray more, and dispute less, and while they behold the signs of the times, look up and confidently expect that redemption draweth nigh." This desire to unify. And eventually Stone would unite his movement with the movement of the Campbells that we talked about earlier. One of the things that really marked Cane Ridge, though, was the intense emotionalism of the experience. You don't see this as much on some of the other fronts of the Second Great Awakening. It's still emotional, but in the West it was really intensified. And that intensified emotion was not always expressed religiously. Some people have said that there were perhaps more souls created than converted at Cane Ridge. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. All right, so it wasn't just this conversionary experience. The emotions spilled out in other ways. Camp meetings, like Cane Ridge, became illegal in some places because there were lots of single mothers 9 months after the revival. But what it did was change a lot of ways people thought about conversion. In previous centuries, the Puritans, the Presbyterians, and others looked at conversion as this long, drawn-out experience, right, that you gradually had to move through. It wasn't the sudden come to faith, be baptized, become a Christian, or anything similar to that, praying Jesus into your heart, or some sort of immediacy. But the Second Great Awakening in Cane Ridge and in the West introduced this very compressed conversion experience. That you could have this immediate conversion, which meant that all that emotion that was present in this desire for conversion, when it would take months or perhaps even years for you to experience conversion, would be compressed and intensified. in those few moments. And the emotions were often expressed in what were known as exercises, these experiences of emotions. Things you might expect: weeping, joy, might even expect falling, right? People so overwhelmed by the emotion that they pass out. But it also expressed itself in things like running. Have you ever been so moved by a sermon that you just want to run? Jumping, jerking, barking. Usually it was due to the jerks, right? You're jerking so much that you just kind of bark. Laughing, dancing, or even singing was talked about at Cambridge. But, not normal type of singing. People would hear like singing coming from somebody else's chest, right? Just kind of like, not through the mouth, through the chest. Right? And so a lot of strange things went on in Cambridge. I cannot do that. I don't know how that was done. Now, not surprisingly, right, with all this going on, not everybody approved of what was going on in Cambridge and other types of camp meetings. And the kind of things that you would expect people to say, they said, right? Things like, God is a God of order, right? He's not a God of barking, right? Or jerks and all these other kind of things. That's not orderly. There were other complaints as well, though. Things like there was too much emphasis on free grace and the human ability to get it. Remember, a lot of people, a lot of Presbyterians especially, would have been Calvinists. But here are these preachers in these revivals, like Cambridge, preaching to people like they have the ability to choose their own salvation. Furthermore, like in the First Great Awakening, there was that lack of educational standards for ministers. And so a lot of opponents to the emotionalism pointed out that these ministers were not educated. And so it led to a variety of splits, specifically among the Presbyterians, who would then later split again over slavery. But with Cambridge, you had the development of the camp meeting. These large gatherings with people coming together for days or weeks, usually in an outdoor setting. There were hundreds of them in the Appalachians through the early 1800s. Times of noise and excitement, preaching. And the theology of the camp meeting usually was one that rejected predestination, but encouraged everyone to choose their salvation, meaning that salvation was available to all. It wasn't just those that God had chosen. Especially successful in all of this are the Methodists. Now remember, Methodism started as a movement within Anglicanism, but after the Revolution, it became a separate denomination. And eventually they would become the almost exclusive users of camp meetings. So camp meetings led to the rise of Methodism, but also the use of circuit riding preachers. Remember, there aren't a lot of religious communities, churches in the frontier, and there are not a lot of preachers either. What Methodists did was use an individual to travel around an area and visit the churches in that area. So you had a circuit, and you rode around that circuit, preaching, bringing religious material, books, right, so publishing starting off. Methodists were baptizing very large numbers. But Methodism as well had a very high standard of morality. Total abstinence of alcohol, tobacco, many of them concerned about slavery. And by the beginning of the Civil War, they were the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. Why were they so successful? Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that as Methodists, they were methodical. Right? They had broken down places to districts and regions. They had oversight by leaders and supervisors. They worked very well at staffing. Right? So a lot of the institutional aspects were done very well. The use of the camp meeting brought religious services and experiences to people spread out from society, so they were able to contact people that might have been overlooked by other denominations. Often they recruited ministers from the common people. And of course that Wesleyan theology was one that was Arminian, one that said, that God did not choose specific people, but that people could be chosen through Christ. Questions about the Second Great Awakening in the West?